I've been interested and curious about what makes people tick, what makes business work. And luckily, I'm here at Vericent, where we are really interested in talking to industry leaders who can answer some of these questions for you and for me. And they're also going to share some of their experiences and insights with you. Today, I'm joined with Sacha Bakht, Director of Global Operations at Volant Technologies. And he's worked across finance, sales, and sales operations, so he can share his perspective on how to work across your revenue engine's three-legged stool. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the telltale signs that something is not working in the sales plan. We're going to talk about some possible tremors or subtle indicators to look out for using data. And then finally, we're going to talk about why culture is so important in sales success. Thank you so much for being here, Sacha.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Amazing. So we've talked a bunch of times before, Sacha. Thank you so much for being here. At the end, folks, if you have any questions, ask them throughout the process. We will answer them at the end. I'm sure Sacha's going to talk about some really cool stuff that may intrigue you to ask the question. And today we're talking about kind of this three-legged stool of the revenue engine. And our market is in kind of this unusual state of volatility. And I think there's always been this level of uncertainty at a leadership level when we think about building this strategic plan for the year. And experience used to be what we would lean on. So people who've been around forever who can provide us with insight. However, data is where people are leaning today. That being said, so many companies are still using this one-size-fits-all quota-setting approach like peanut butter spread, but companies that do that only achieve about 14% quota attainment. So, Sacha, as we talk about kind of the three-legged stool, or even if you were a brand new sales ops leader, what are some of the questions that you would ask yourself to understand the health of the sales plan?
Yeah, I think the kind of the first thing I do when I think of the health of the sales plan is go to say, how is it built? We talked about the building blocks a little bit. I like to think of marketing, channel or partner, sales, and sales operations are kind of the key players around that. And just understanding, how did you build out those territories? How did you set the comp? Is the plan realistic? So, some of the things that I think it's really worth thinking about are do you have a lot of new sales reps, and are you building ramp time in? Very often, we're kind of expecting somebody who's brand new to, in the plan anyway, have the same kind of a quota as someone who's been around for a little while. I think it's really worth sort of planning that piece out and getting it right. Also around territories, you spoke about peanut butter spread, and that's a process that really doesn't take into account the variations in territories, and very often there are. I'll give you an example. In a past life of mine, we had different verticals that we sold into. So, say the Fins vertical, or not-for-profit, or HLS, like health and life sciences. And we kind of had this metric that looked at how mature these verticals were. If you imagine a graph, on one side we had the win rate. And on the other side we had average deal size. And when you have a mature market, typically you have some anchor clients that will lead, that you can sort of use as examples to get other clients. And also they're going to buy typically more things. And we found that the deal sizes would get bigger over time. So on the right side of the quadrant are your mature markets. So you have high win rates and you have large average deal sizes. And then your less mature markets, you're going to be talking to a lot of new customers, drumming up business. Your win rates are going to be a lot lower. And you're going to need, therefore, a lot more pipeline to break into that market. So I think if you set your territory expectations differently because of those two things, you'll have a more sort of fair and realistic sales plan.
Okay, so I heard two big things. One is make sure to take into account the experience of your sales rep. Like if they're building from scratch, it's going to take some time. The second thing was kind of the experience of your company within a particular industry. If you've got a proven success rate, then it's reasonable that you'll continue to sell in that market.
Yeah. And I think the goal here is, you want to have, if you have a bunch of different territories, ideally, you have some mature markets where you're going to get more reliable, higher win rates. And then the question strategically might be, listen, which of these sort of other markets do we want to invest in to get them to be mature markets in the end? That might take some experimentation. Maybe you find, look, we tried this one, didn't work out. But very often I find it's the sort of reference clients that you have, those wins, those big wins that lead on to others that snowball, and then they also rebuy.
Well, yeah, I was chatting, or I was actually looking through one of our customer case studies, and they actually had made some assumptions a couple of years before about how their business was going to grow. And they were kind of panicked because they had this feeling that the only place that they had to grow was in their small accounts to grow bigger and within these particular industries. And very quickly, once they included, they aggregated their data and used some AI, they discovered very quickly that the assumptions they've outgrown actually. So the industries that they thought were their target industries are no longer their target industries. They opened up some low-hanging fruit in terms of industries that'd be a great fit. And also, it was quite the opposite. It was actually their larger accounts that had the propensity to buy more. So by evaluating their data, they were able to understand that some of their assumptions had kind of expired.
It's a really, really great point. Sort of checking the data on a regular and kind of doing these deep dives from time to time to say, are our prevailing assumptions sort of still good? Do they make sense? Yeah. And you can look at things like average deal size, length to win, like how long it takes to close one of your opportunities, win rates, of course. And sometimes it's a matter of volume of pipeline too. Do you have enough companies to go after to sort of get there? And that's kind of back to the planning of the sales plan. How are you kind of building out your funnel? How much are you relying on marketing to supply MQLs or channel? How much do you expect the sales reps to do on their own? And then, of course, the process of actually closing those deals.
Yeah, and I think that flows really nicely into the next question, which was, once this plan is built and you feel like you've done an okay job with building your plan, your territories feel equitable, you feel like your sellers are aligned, you're in the middle of the fiscal year. You talked about things like pipeline and close rates and kind of progression through pipeline. Let's talk a little bit about some of the signs that should be a little more easy to detect that something's not working in the plan. We're midway through the year. What are the things that you look at?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one that, of course, everyone's going to look at is how are you doing against your target overall? So,
yeah, that one.
That's a big one, and one simple way to look at it, of course, is you're halfway through the year. Have you hit halfway through your budget? That might not be relevant. Very often, companies will have much bigger weighting on quarter four, for example, and so maybe you're okay. But those are sort of the obvious ones. Other pieces I like to look at, particularly when you get, depending on how long your deal cycle is, if it's 6 months, you have a really clear picture that actually there's really bad news. And the best way to look at it is, what's the pipeline that you have, the open pipeline available? And how long does it take to close your opportunities? If your deal cycle is very long, you might get the bad news of, look, we don't have enough, based on the stages that we're at right now, we don't have the pipeline what we need to win the deals. And so I think one thing that sales operations really have a good handle on is, what's your average time to win for overall deals? And what's your average time to win at various stages? So, if you're in your sales stage 3, is it 90 more days to win? If you're in sales stage 5, is it 30 more days? Then we look at the composition of your pipeline and you say, well, someone's put in a close date that's in 15 days, but typically you need 30. That's where, the data isn't always the answer. Of course, it could happen. They could close that deal, but that's where you probe and ask the question. Say, look, are we doing the things that we need to do to close this? Do we have the right decision makers on there? Do we have internal buy-in, et cetera, et cetera? So that's kind of a tremor that's useful, I think. That's it.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I was going to say, like, I think, when you talk about it, they're the super obvious ones, right? Like, are people winning or are they not? There's this very generic stat, 3x pipeline, but based on what? We talked about win rates. We talked about time to close a deal, and the length of time it takes for a deal that is less than $100,000 versus 250,000 plus can be drastically different. So being able to put your thumb on those things to determine whether these things are likely to close in the period it says can be really important, and perhaps can be overlooked maybe from a seller's perspective when they're just throwing up a date for a close. And also that pipeline size should maybe differ based on the win rates of those reps, right? So the 3x rate assumes you have a 33% win rate. You're going to close 1/3 of everything you bring in. But is that usually the case? What have you seen?
I've seen a lot of variety. So I think that's a really great point. So even earlier on, you kind of spoke to, these were the assumptions that company had. They'd outgrown those assumptions. When I was talking about those, the company I was at, where we had different verticals, where we had mature markets and immature markets. Yeah. In those mature markets, and also with really experienced reps, we had win rates that were, 60%, sometimes 70%, really, really high. Somebody like that needs a lot less pipeline to hit their number. But if you're talking about our immature market or a new rep where win rates are, sub 30%, maybe they're 20%. You need a lot more pipeline to chew through before you're going to get to where you want to go. Mm-hmm. So I think really sort of segmenting your business, and you made a great point there. Maybe your enterprise deals are larger deals that have act differently from maybe your small, medium business. Maybe you do it by vertical, but cutting it in different ways to understand it's not always going to work the same way. If you sort of zoom back and make it all averages as a whole, it doesn't tell you as much as if you break up in meaningful ways for your business.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult if you're having to do that all manually. It's certainly easier if you're a smaller, more agile organization, or if you've got, a great team or really great tools. So those are kind of the big guys, right? The how often you're closing things, what your pipeline looks like, pipeline health. And when we were talking, I think we mutually came up with this term, like the tremors. That's the smoke signals that something might be happening in the business. Like, they're not going to hit you over the head. No seller is going to come to you and say, like, hey, I just don't think this is working. I'm going to finish about 20% this year. Good day. So it's up to you to kind of identify some of these tremors. What do you think some of those might be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few behavioral ones I see out there. There's a lot of the times you kind of keep getting deals that are pushed, or look, I'm going to make the quarter, everything's going to be great, and the last minute bad surprises where things get pushed. And I think that's one example. Another one I've seen is sometimes when things aren't going well, I've seen sales leaders or salespeople sort of question the data, say, hey, look, my numbers look different here, or sort of go down a winding path of analysis that's really not, focused on the main metrics that you're looking at. It's almost like an attempt to distract to the problem. I mean, you do sort of forecast meetings and QBRs, and typically each person only has a few minutes to talk through it. And if you can deflect the attention, that can sort of take the focus away from the problem. So those are some of the smaller things I've kind of seen that can be out there. Other sort of metric-based ones are, how are your demand gen kind of metrics working? Yeah, maybe you have a outbound sales team with what's meetings, and typically you get meetings at a certain rate at a certain time of year. If that's sort of falling off, or maybe your MQLs that are coming across are converting at the similar kind of rate, that might speak to some macro trends that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're talking like about, again, the more holistic picture, right? So we're thinking about MQLs or marketing qualified leads, the ones that are, essentially paid for by all those gorgeous ads that you see, and by your marketing efforts. The second might be this push deals, like, holy cow, that's scary at the end at the end of the quarter. Um, but also that information starts to become a little more identifiable over time. But I was talking about the holistic picture before I got distracted by my pipeline. So we were talking about, marketing, we were talking about demand gen, and also other indicators within sales. So it's looking at the multifacets that there might be something that's not quite lined up in order to get you to success.
I was going to say, I think, some of those behavioral issues I was kind of referring to, that sort of thing can happen sometimes when you have a culture at an organization where the sales team or the sales leaders don't feel like they're allowed to fail. And they feel like they have to say they're going to get their number. I probably heard this stuff before and say, look, if you lose a deal, you have to have another deal to replace that deal. That assumes that I'm hiding a deal somewhere. It's not out there. It's not open. And I think it's the wrong approach. I think what's better is, look, bad news is going to happen. You want to know about it as a leadership team as soon as possible, so that you can adjust. So maybe, your vertical A is having a tough time from a macro perspective. Things are looking bad. Say, okay, cool. Well, then maybe vertical B is the one who can take up the slack. But they won't know that unless vertical A is upfront and feels like they can have that honest conversation that things aren't going well. So that I've seen that work well in a few places. And I think when you can have that open, collaborative environment in sales, it really pays off.
That's an interesting point you make. I think I mentioned to you in previous chats that I was in sales for longer than I care to mention, and several different companies. And there were certainly a wide swing of cultures from the, okay, that deal's not coming in, and it might have come in the week after the period closed, but just not in the period they thought it was going to. And it's like, okay, well, what deal do you have to replace it? And that's really scary as a sales rep. And so that one conversation creates this culture of bloating your pipeline, inflating your win rates, not admitting when you're in trouble. Because like a couple of key things happen from there, right? Either a bunch of bad performance, or you have sellers who just leave. So then you're trying to fill the gap of these dissatisfied sellers. So the big question is, like, how have you seen an open, collaborative culture work? And what are some things or tactics people have tried to make it feel like it was okay to say, I'm not going to win this time?
So, I mean, one really interesting sort of tactic that I've seen in a company was every quarter, the company had an overall sales target, and everybody in the company would get a bonus if they hit the target. Of course, if you're not a seller, frontline seller is going to be less than the sellers themselves, and each individual seller has their own quota. So, what this kind of created was this amazing sort of quarter end interest and, celebration around Slack. People would literally stay up to midnight and watch the sales roll in.
Cool.
And if you're a seller, let's say you've hit your target a month ago and you're like, oh, maybe in a normal situation, I might save some of those deals for next quarter for myself. But instead here, you're trying to get everyone across the finish line together. So you have this motivation that's not necessarily just money motivation to try to get one more deal to help out, another seller or another department that's having trouble. So knowing that you have each other's back and you're kind of winning together is one way to do it. It's not easy. Like the reality is when you're a seller, you're only as good as your last sale. And, there's real danger. People feel they're worried about their jobs, all that sort of thing. But if you can create an environment where something's not going well, you can ask for help. Maybe there's some mentoring, maybe there's some coaching. Maybe you get an executive on your team to talk to an executive at the account you're at to try to give it a boost.
Yeah. And, in thinking about the different types of culture, and certainly you can't fix everything with everybody try to work well together. But I can say that, part of a dangerous culture is when the sales operations, like we're talking about ideas where something is off the rails. Then we're talking about like where you need to dig a little harder to find things off the rails. And now we're saying, okay, but have a positive culture. And I think part of it is from the people who are assessing the data. I think you're exactly right. And that it's not so that you can tell a sales rep that you got them. Like your pipeline's bloated and you're not going to get there. You only have 15 days to close, which should take 45 days to close. Like it's not about that. It's about how can we all be successful? And it's just this like same side, two different sides of the same coin, right? It's the same message, but presented in a completely different way. And so I think that cultural piece is so important when trying to keep your sellers motivated and keeping everyone positive in terms of how you present the data that you're uncovering on a daily basis.
That's a really great point. I think the sort of gotcha side of thing is a terrible way to sort of use data. I often think about it like all of these metrics, win rates, deal sizes, et cetera. These are tools for individual sellers I'm trying to help them to hit their goals. And if your comp plan is set up right, then that means that the company is hitting their goals. So we're all here to help each other out and do that. And I think it's so important to be seen as sales operations as sort of the arm that's going to help them along, as opposed to the police. Sometimes you're the police a little bit, but
Fill out your Salesforce already.
Yeah, there's not.
So we touched on comp a little tiny bit there, and working for Vericent, there's this idea that compensation, when used correctly, can bolster what you're trying to accomplish with this go-to-market plan. That being said, how do you think that comp can really effectively motivate good behavior?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll start with the opposite. And one thing that I don't like to include in comp is some of those factors like that build up to the sale. Like I would never comp win rate, because what happens is if you want to game the system, you just never close your opportunities. Let those terrible ones just sit there forever. And guess what? Your win rate's going to look great.
100%.
Yeah. So there's always sort of ways to game the system. So ultimately, you look at those things, you coach on those things, you make them aware, but you'll pay out sort of on the results you're looking for. Ideally, not always possible depending on the role. But spiffs are a great way to, companies use them all the time to create a sort of burst of focus on something that's important in the day. The one pitfall that I've seen there is if they're sort of regular and everyone knows, oh, there's the Q3 demand gen spiff. Guess what? Save all your demand gen till then.
It's true. It's true.
So it's important.
I've seen that happen.
Surprise people.
I don't know who, but someone did that in the past, I think. But yeah, I think that's a good point. It's like they're intended to be, they're special incentive programs, right? That's their purpose. And it's interesting. The CEO of Vericent would argue that spiffs are an indication of a plan that is not quite working right. Right? It's like if you have made the plan, or if you have built it in a way that it can adapt and tweak based on the market conditions or what's happening in your business, then there's no need for spiffs in a perfect world. But interesting that, it still works. You have a new product, you have a new feature, you have a new geo, you have a new industry. Like Now everybody gets an extra 10% for selling into FinServe. Well, that's where I'm spending all my time, right? So I
Yeah.
get it. So we were talking about motivating good behavior. I think before we also talked about kind of the timing of payment. I know companies handle this all different ways. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a really strong link to the quicker you're rewarded for your performance, the more it sort of gels and incentivizes you. So paying reps faster is a huge, huge thing. Um, I've in the past sort of implemented situations where you pay 1 month after payment, so it used to be a quarter. It really does make a massive difference. I mean, number one is morale. The team's going to
Yep.
really like that, but you also sort of are driving for those wins because it's not just some future payment that eventually you'll get. And ideally, you're also sort of as a sales rep not having to lawyer, and you have a trust that I will get paid that. It's not sort of another job to have to prove that I should get paid.
Yeah, I think that's a fine thing to mention too. Again, I'm all about the storytelling today, so stay with me. We'll get there. One of my girlfriends worked for a company, and they got an Excel spreadsheet 1 month after it closed, and then they had to like review their 8 scroll Excel spreadsheet and determine if it was right, and they got paid a quarter later, kind of thing. So I think there is something to be said for, connecting the behavior to what should have been the motivation, or giving the stick a tad earlier. So as we round the corner to almost being out of time, have you seen any like creative or interesting ways that have been effective at motivating people that maybe you don't see everywhere?
Yeah. Great question there. So I think when you can find sort of non-monetary rewards that work, when you give people recognition. So, we're going back to that sort of end of quarter push where everybody's kind of watching. I remember the company had, a special award for the person who got that deal that pushed it over the edge. And
Yep.
maybe that was their only deal of the quarter, but they were recognized in a sales meeting. And taking the time to recognize people, not just the number one salesperson, but sort of the number one collaborator, all this sort of stuff that helps. And I shout out to all the sales ops folks. It's nice to sort of recognize those people who are helping along the way as well, and showing that they're important. So that's one thing. I think monetary rewards will always be there. And I think as a salesperson, if you're motivated by money, that's probably a pretty good thing. But non-monetary are helpful too.
So it's interesting because, you clearly have a data analytical brain, yet you almost constantly like back it up with things that are going to support positive culture. So it seems like you'd be a great person to work with and for. So there is that. As we round towards our quick question segment, are you ready? I just have 10 to 20 quick questions I'm going to bang through. What was your very first job?
Yeah, so my first job was delivering the Toronto Star. I think I was 9 years old, and I worked 363 days a year. So I got Christmas Day and Easter or Good Friday off, I think, and I did it for like 5 years. My mom likes to tell me that sometimes she'd drive me around when it rained, but I think that was like few and far between.
Amazing. One that I like to ask people is, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I think I recall, let's see, I went through a bunch of stages. I recall the first one my parents told me about is that I wanted to be, that postman. I think that I just really like the idea. For all those people out there who are sort of a little bit younger, that's when they delivered mail to your house. And just
Versus to 90 boxes in one little area. Yeah.
and then sort of channeling my sort of George Costanza. I wanted to be an import-export for a while.
Yeah.
I had this trip to India when I was a teenager, and I was just shocked by, wow, all this stuff is like so cheap. The compared to Canada. Let's find a way to make this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. I don't know if I've ever asked that question and anyone has ever said I wanted to get into import exports. I love it. Super unique. What what would you say is your number one follow on LinkedIn?
So I'm a big fan of Sarah McNamara. She's a sort of a marketing ops guru, and
Oh, cool.
me being in the sales ops world, I'm always kind of looking over to marketing ops, and it's very complicated. It's tough to do well, and I think she's kind of a real leader, a thought leader in that space.
Love it. I'll have to look her up. What is your favorite meal of all time?
That's a tough one, but I'm gonna have to go with my mom's korma and roti. If you don't know what it is, it's a lamb dish that's super spicy with lots of gravy, and it's yeah, nobody makes it better than mom, right?
I have heard these things. I'll be over for Gorma and Roti. This is how I get invitations to people's houses to eat
You-
their mom's best
You're welcome
dishes.
anytime.
And finally, it wouldn't be a What I Wish I Knew series episode if I didn't ask you, what do you wish you knew more about?
You know, the biggest thing out there in the world that's the buzz topic is AI, and I think it's real. I think it's the real deal. And we're kind of at this stage now where it's like, what could it do for me, and all these questions and how it's actually going to work. So I would love to kind of explore how does this really practically help us? How do we sort of 2x and 3x our efforts in sales operations and sales, maybe sales enablement? So really curious to kind of unravel that onion as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Luckily, our CEO is like super impassioned with AI, and so he's set up these tiger teams in the business to learn a little more about it. But it's hard to find time to look into everything that's of interest. But thank you for sharing yours. So I would say, as we talk today, the goal was to go through, the big issues, the tremors, and the superpower that is culture. And certainly, I think if you reiterated that, um, some of the big things that I took away were some of those tremors or some of the more subtle ideas that things aren't going quite right is this pushed forecast right at the end of a sales cycle, or this misdirecting, misleading when you've got only a little bit of time in a pipeline call. Certainly been there when that kind of thing happened, when the time to close doesn't match up with how much time they actually have left in the pipeline. So that's one of the things. Those tremors I think are really, really helpful. um, the second thing is things to avoid when you're building culture or when you're a part of a culture, and that's that the no fail culture can't work. It creates a situation where it's really, really difficult for people to be vulnerable and get to success. And the second thing was this idea of sales op acting as the police and the gotchas for reps. So avoiding those things and instead leaning towards kind of a winning culture together, um, and ensuring that you can have the conversation about the health of pipeline from an honest perspective. So honesty, trustworthiness, openness as a way to build culture so everybody's winning together. So those are my key takeaways. Sacha, thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure. I can't wait for Roti. And thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It was my pleasure, and so it was a wonderful series, and just happy to be here and share.